We all know where we were. If you're over 40, you remember where you were and what you were doing when you heard the news. There are moments in life when time freezes, when the clock stops. For my generation, this was that moment. 30 years later, shocked by JFK's assassination, then horrified and numb by the tragic deaths of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King, we somehow became hardened to it all. Somewhere between Dallas and Vietnam and Watergate and Iran-Contra and whatever that Clinton thing was. Conspiracies became easier to believe in than our own government, but still, there were the questions.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
Hello, and welcome to Midnight in America. My name is Daniel Hopsicker, and I will be your host on a journey into the life and times of one of the most famous CIA agents that ever lived, a man by the name of Adler, Barham, and Barry Seal. We're standing on the steps of the federal courthouse in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, that were walked up and down by Barry Seal many times in the course of his illustrious career. And we're going to take a look at Barry's life, and we're going to ask a simple question. Could the scandals of the 1960s and 1970s be somehow related to the cocaine epidemic that swept America during the 1980s? An epidemic fueled in no small part by the billions of dollars worth of cocaine brought into this country by the most successful drug smuggler in American history, Barry Seal? Let's take a look.
So who was Barry Seal and why is he so important? Barry Seal was the most successful drug smuggler in American history, and the cause of the Mina drug scandal, where he flew in, by the government's own estimates, over $5 billion worth of cocaine from 1981 to 1986 to fuel the go-go 80s and to fund the Contra War when the U.S. Congress would not. He is the root cause of what is today called the Clinton scandals. So, was Barry Seal, called the Ghost, haunting the Whitewater probe, just an extraordinarily zealous entrepreneur operating all by himself? Did the big-time players in the small backward state of Arkansas, Clinton, Vince Foster, Jackson Stevens, Jim Blair, Don Tyson, stand idly by while Seal made billions, importing tons of cocaine through Mina? Or might the goings-on in Mina, Arkansas of Barry and the boys have been just the continuation of business as usual? In America, we've heard all about the Colombian drug lords, whose cocaine and heroin have flooded our nation. Names like Pablo Escobar, Jorge Ochoa, Carlos Later. But there's one huge unanswered question we've never even heard asked. Who are the American drug lords? Anyone in, say, Washington, D.C.? Could Barry Seal really have been involved with everyone from Republican Attorney General Ed Meese to former Democratic National Chair Charles Manat to current Al Gore campaign Chairman Tony Coelho? And is there really a suspicious link between Barry and the boss's son, George W. Bush? To answer these questions, we're going back to the beginnings of Barry Seal's CIA career, to hear from eyewitnesses and participants who were there for this most important chapter of America's secret history. That history, in other words, in which lone gunmen play no role. Remember, of the numerous witnesses in Dealey Plaza who pointed to the grassy knoll as the place where shots came from, none were ever interviewed on the evening news until well after it no longer mattered. That won't happen with the Mina drug scandal. You're about to hear an extraordinary kind of oral history, straight from the mouths of members of the tight-knit pilots fraternity of Louisiana who knew and worked with Barry Seal. While Richard Nixon was still in the White House, Professor Peter Dale Scott wrote, "A full exposure of the Watergate conspiracy will help us understand both what happened in Dallas and also the covert forces which mired America in a covert war in Southeast Asia. What links the scandal of Watergate to the assassination in Dallas is the ominous merger between U.S. intelligence networks and the forces of organized crime. Most of Watergate's shadow players dwell in the same conspiratorial world that led to the Bay of Pigs, the assassination plots involving CIA mob teamwork, the gun and drug running syndicates formed in pre-revolutionary Cuba, later transplanted to Miami, and the JFK assassination cover-up. Barry Seal, we will hear, was an active participant in all these events, flying guns to Fidel Castro in the mountains of Cuba while the CIA supported him, piloting a P-51 fighter in support of the Bay of Pigs invasion, flying a getaway plane out of Dallas after the Kennedy assassination. And all this before he became famous for importing tons of cocaine through Mena, Arkansas in the drug smuggling scandal that dogged President Clinton throughout his time in office. Commenting on the CIA's affair with the mafia, LBJ's press secretary Bill Moyers said, "Once we decide that anything goes, anything can come home to haunt us." This is the story of what happens when guys we pay to protect us, CIA guys, go into business with guys we're paying them to protect us against, made guys, mobsters, organized crime. This is the story of Barry Seal, the biggest drug smuggler in American history, who died in a hail of bullets with George Bush's private phone number in his wallet. The saga of Barry Seal begins here, Louisiana, the only place in the Western world where you can still get a drive-through daiquiri in a monogram Go Cup. In 1699, an expedition of French explorers came upon a clearing at the point where two streams join a bayou 100 miles from the mouth of the mighty Mississippi River. A surveyor marked it off with tiny red wooden sticks. Today, its name, French for red stick, is Baton Rouge, where Barry Seal was born in the months just before World War II. Maybe it's the influence of the Big Muddy flowing by, but Baton Rouge has always had a slightly raffish air. Long before the Civil War, an old steamer here served as headquarters for the gamblers that ran the river, who many a night played cards until dawn. Mark Twain hated this mock castle at Baton Rouge that served as the early capital, but even he praised the magnolia trees, lovely and fragrant with their dense, rich foliage and huge snowball blossoms. Today, the charm of the antebellum mansions back in their shady groves of live oaks and Spanish moss suddenly gives way to an industrial expanse. One minute you're driving along the frontage of Terra, and the next you see a pile of steel and sheet metal with octopus arms and bulgy pipes and conveyor belts leaning against the river, where America's Fortune 500 churn out the products of daily life, from oil refineries to prescription drugs to the wax coating on milk cartons. But Louisiana has always had a darker side. Your buddy on the Big Muddy wears corruption as a badge of honor. Former Governor Edwin Edwards, for example, is always on trial for something or other, like bribery involving casino licenses. Edwards has already survived 11 grand juries, a pension for gambling in women other than the First Lady, and the bald declaration that his only undoing would be if he were caught in bed with a dead girl or a live boy. A Baton Rouge DEA official told us he'd been way ahead of the country in figuring Bill Clinton out because he'd already seen Edwin Edwards operate. And sources told us Barry Seal paid Edwards so much money to look the other way that it took 3 small planes to cart it all offshore for deposit. And it's here in old New Orleans, just a few bends further down the Mississippi, where much of our story takes place, where musicians on Bourbon Street still hammer out 3-chord blues on old guitars, and where one can find ancient 18th century skulls and black velvet paintings illustrating the lineages of past voodoo priestesses. Back in the 50s, when Barry Seal was growing up, Baton Rouge was booming, and it was a great time to be a kid, according to author Richmond Odom, who grew up in the same neighborhood as Barry.
My oldest brother and Barry were very close friends. They started out building model airplanes together, and they would fly them. There was a synagogue behind our house and a little vacant lot next to it, and they would fly model airplanes out there. And when the boys got old enough to really take a serious interest in aviation, They both went to the old downtown airport where they learned how to fly planes in something called the Civil Air Patrol.
Much later, Barry will become the most successful drug smuggler in American history, but the 50s were a time when, as Jimmy Buffett says, only jazz musicians were smoking marijuana. And the young Barry would join a group of guys and pile into somebody's daddy's car, usually a big old clunky Ford or Chevy, and head out to some dance hall to stand around holding a cold Falstaff or Jack's long neck, listen to the music, and try to look cool while working up the nerve to ask the girls to dance. There were also the football trips involving long bus rides. And this is where young Barry Seal first began to stand out. He didn't take the bus. Instead, he flew, having gotten a pilot's license at the tender age of 15. Eddie Dufford is the man who taught Barry Seal to fly.
Barry was that devil was a fella that you couldn't get angry with. He wouldn't let you get angry with him. He'd do something wrong, and most of the time, everything he did, you know, we had to get on him about it. But he'd just look at you and grin, and you say, "Oh, hell with it," and let it go, you know. You couldn't get him to do right. He did what he wanted to do. Oh man, he was just a kid throwing newspapers for the Morning Advocate and State Times. I think he was just about 15 years old, and his mother didn't want me to teach him to fly, and I told her, I said, "Lou, if I don't teach him to fly, he's just going to go next door. There's 4 schools out at the downtown airport," and I said, "He's going to learn to fly. He's made up his mind. He's going to learn to fly." I said, "You want him to fly with me or somebody you don't know?" She said, "Go ahead and teach him." And he was real easy to teach. He was a first cousin to a bird.
James Poche was a pilot who grew up with Barry.
He was a pilot, and Barry already had a commercial operation. He was a charter pilot, and that's pretty rare in high school.
Then, while most young men his age were still working up the courage to ask their girl to go steady, Barry Seal began demonstrating his courage by flying daring undercover missions into Cuba, bringing Fidel Castro's insurgents weapons courtesy of the American CIA. David Holmes is another Baton Rouge pilot who grew up with Barry.
Barry was just the kind of guy you could talk to, and he was very friendly, jovial, and everything else, but when you finished talking to him, you didn't know any more than when you started.
Yeah, Barry had a lot of secret lives. He loved that James Bond shit, you know.
He knew Johnny Rivers, didn't he?
Oh, yeah, yeah. We used to fly Johnny around. Yeah, secret agent man.
Was that song about Barry?
I often wonder.
When did the rumors about his flying P-51s start?
Well, that was all around that Cuban time down there when people were, you know, being ferried out of there, and I heard rumors to that effect, you know, that Barry was down there flying, and he disappeared during those periods of time.
The anti-Castro revolution touched Louisiana, and especially its small pilot fraternity, in ways the rest of the country knew nothing about.
There was a lot of guys back then who were supposed to be flying to South America that you heard about. That, hey, the Gulf Coast was wide open then. Anything could have happened. United Fruit was real big in Central America, and they were running clandestine planes. And
It was a brand new twin-engine airplane, an Apache, and the man said he wanted to rent the airplane to make a swing around the country, the southwestern part of the country, to buy airplanes. And what he did, he went on down into Cuba with that airplane, landed on the highway, and was flying people out for so much money, and got shot down, and Reggie lost his airplane on account of the war clause. The insurance company wouldn't pay it.
I had no idea how big it was till I hit down in Miami and met a few Cubans and realized there's some crazy things going on. There was a time in history.
But for those who flew at the Bay of Pigs, and those who knew them, 40 years later there is still a reluctance to talk.
What's funny is he used to sit around and read these Soldier Fortune magazines, and one day we might go to Cuba and this and that. He mentioned it, and Barry was all into that. He liked that arms smuggling and clandestine life type stuff. And back at that age, man, you want a P-51 and a Thunderbird to drive in and pick up pretty girls, you know. And Yeah, he fantasized about it. I don't know if it happened or not. But
We ended up with Thunderbird, didn't he?
yeah. Several of them.
For over 40 years, the story of how Barry Seal was recruited into the CIA, into America's clandestine services, has been a well-kept secret. No longer. This is a picture of 16-year-old Seal preparing to step onto a U.S. Air Force plane, bound for a 2-week summer camp of the Louisiana Civil Air Patrol at Barksdale Air Force Base. There he will meet fellow cadet Lee Harvey Oswald, and there both will fall into the orbit of the freakish David Ferry, best remembered by his portrayal by actor Joe Pesci in Oliver Stone's film JFK.
There was another Civil Air Patrol unit at Lakefront Airport in New Orleans, and that was a decidedly different Civil Air Patrol unit. The leader of the New Orleans Lakefront Airport Civil Air Patrol unit was a guy named David Ferry. David Ferry was a professional airline pilot with Eastern Air, flew for Eastern. One Friday night, Barry called my brother. Now, they were teenagers at the time. They were both in high school, and Barry asked my brother John, said, "Do you want to fly over to Lacombe with me in the morning?" And they left out that morning at 5:30 or 6 o'clock and got to Lacombe probably 30 minutes later. When they landed on the tarmac, my brother saw some interesting things. One was that there were two groups of people out there assembled. One was the Civil Air Patrol unit from Lakefront, and again, this 50 or 60 boys, and they were in formation. The other group was what appeared to be, my brother doesn't speak Spanish, but he understood that they were Spanish-speaking men. They were wearing military fatigues, combat boots, and the distinctive green fatigue cap that soldiers wear. He said there was a very strange-looking man sitting in a director's chair. It was a black folding director's chair, and the man had a .45 caliber pistol strapped to his side in a leather holster. And what was so strange about him was that he appeared to be wearing a complete wig, in addition to having strange-looking eyebrows, and he had obviously no body hair. Because my brother didn't know this at the time, but it was David Ferry, and David Ferry had a rare skin disorder, and he had no hair on his body. Periodically, Barry would point to the crates, and sometimes David Ferry would point to the crates. And after about 10 minutes of conversation, Barry came back over to my brother. He says, "John, how'd you like to make about $400 a week?" And to put this in perspective, my dad made about $400 a month, and he was asking my brother if he wanted to make $400 a week. And my brother said, "Well, what, doing what?" He said, "Flying planes with me." As we later discovered, David Ferry was probably at the time working for the Central Intelligence Agency, and it appears that Barry Seal was working for David Ferry.
While still an impressionable teenager, both Barry Seal and Lee Harvey Oswald came under the tutelage of a man you wouldn't want your worst enemy's kid to know, David Ferry, a pedophile, and worse.
Oh, he's a real weird guy. Wore a wig, looked like somebody's carpet that he took off the floor and put on his head. It was real strange. He was a real strange guy. Every now and then it would fall off. He'd be talking to you and it would slip, and he was bald-headed. He lived in the quarters, and he held weddings at his house, and just weird things. He'd marry street people, and there was parties, and he was just one of them guys.
Something strange went on in the Louisiana Civil Air Patrol of the middle 1950s. Something which will lead us onward like a trail of breadcrumbs through the signal events of America's secret history in the second half of the 20th century.
First time you ever heard his name was during one of these joint maneuvers with the New Orleans Civil Air Patrol unit. And the guy was a very popular member of the Civil Air Patrol. His name was Lee. And my brother heard the man's name for the second time in his life. In November 1963, November 22nd to be exact, when it was announced on the TV news that President Kennedy had been assassinated, and that the person that they had taken in custody and charged with the murder was Lee Harvey Oswald, the same man my brother had known as a member of the Civil Air Patrol unit in New Orleans. It's obvious that David Ferry, as commander of that Civil Air Patrol unit in New Orleans, was the commander for Lee Harvey Oswald, probably at the time that these Cuban soldiers were being trained in Lacombe. And it doesn't take a mental giant to put the rest of it together. You just have to figure, well, if Oswald was under Ferry in the Civil Air Patrol, now here's Oswald being inculpated in connection with the assassination of the President of the United States a few years later. Some very strange things were happening in the New Orleans and Baton Rouge areas back then.
The House Select Committee on Assassinations tried to find Oswald and David Ferry's records in the Civil Air Patrol files, but in the first in a sordid series of lost and stolen documents that have kept America's secret history hidden from the American people, they discovered that most of the records of the squadron had been stolen. One record, which escaped being stolen, however, reveals that Oswald joined the Civil Air Patrol on July 27, 1955, while at summer camp with Dave Ferry and Barry Seal. Here we recall how for 40 years, Warren Commission apologists have tried to tell us that Oswald and Ferry didn't even know each other. But we didn't have to look any further than the New Orleans Public Library to meet someone who knew different. Colin Hamer was a fellow Civil Air Patrol cadet with Lee Harvey Oswald in David Ferry's squadron.
Lee Harvey Oswald was in my Civil Air Patrol unit from the summer, sometime in the summer of 1955. I was in recruit class with him.
As it turns out, the feds were interested in David Ferry and Barry Seal long before the Kennedy assassination.
I did speak to the agents of the U.S. Border Patrol about Ferry before the assassination. They seemed to think that he had something to do with getting Carlos Marcello back into the country after he was deported.
They had. David Ferry intimate Alvin Bobuff confirmed to us that he had picked Ferry up at the airport following his return from Guatemala with Marcello. So, just who was this man, David Ferry, who recruited both Barry Seal and Lee Harvey Oswald? Here's another 40-year-old secret revealed. Ferry himself was recruited in 1942 into the CIA's predecessor organization during World War II, which he spent flying undercover missions in South America. Eddie Shearer was in Ferry's Civil Air Patrol outfit before joining the Air Force.
For a long time, starting in about 56, Dave Ferry took over as the senior commander for the cadet squadron. When the cadets drilled, we also had what's called a guide on. One of the guys was playing with it, and it got away from him, and the thing cut his hand in the palm. And that's when I realized that Dave had probably been doing hypnosis with him or some other, because he went to him and had him hold his hand up and then started speaking to him, saying that you'll feel sensation, no pain, the bleeding will stop. And it did. And I also realized from reading about hypnosis that you couldn't do this on your first time. And you don't put somebody under instantly like that within 10 or 15 seconds. But if you have worked with a subject a number of times, they'll go under very quickly.
Even so, it's still a shock to hear the truth casually revealed that David Ferry ran the CIA's Southern Office of Civil Air Transport.
No, I met David in 1965, Lakefront Airport in New Orleans. I was working for Delta. Well, I didn't know anything about him, other than he owned 5 DC-3s that he was flying into the Lakefront Airport. Dave was, he had a little office at Lakefront Airport, and it was like an FBO type thing that didn't do anything but fly. Never saw any passengers. There was pilots working out there. They flew bodies, supposedly, like they had a service where they flew caskets.
5 years after Dave Ferry's untimely suicide on the eve of being called to testify in front of Jim Garrison's grand jury, these same 5 DC-3s were controlled by Barry Seal. Barry Seal's role in the Kennedy assassination was proven to us
when we discovered this picture of some of the conspirators taken in a Mexico City nightclub exactly 10 months before JFK was murdered. This photo is the only visual record of the super-secret CIA assassination squad known as Operation 40, active from Mexico City to New Orleans to Dallas. That's Barry Seal, a young-looking 24-year-old. And there's CIA agent and professional assassin Felix Rodriguez, George Bush's great good friend from Iran-Contra, remember? He's the guy who tracked down and killed Che Guevara in Bolivia, and who to this day reportedly keeps Guevara's hand sitting in a jar on his bedroom dresser. And covering his face with his sport coat, that's Frank Sturgis, Watergate burglar, Bay of Pigs operative, and a man who before he died made a written confession of his role in the JFK assassination. And see that dapper guy, front right? Meet the man researchers refer to as the Second Oswald for his role in impersonating Lee Harvey Oswald in order to incriminate the patsy. His name is William Seymour, from the CIA front called the Double Check Corporation, where his job was to recruit pilots like Barry Seal. This picture is an important historical document, a crucial piece of America's secret history, that history, in other words, in which lone gunmen play no role. There are a lot of different landmarks in New Orleans in the Kennedy assassination that I haven't seen very often on films or tapes, like this one behind me. This is the home, while he lived in New Orleans in 1963, of Lee Harvey Oswald. He lived in the back on the other side. What's not generally known about this home is that it may well have been a CIA safe house. Why do I say that? Well, during the time that Lee Oswald lived here, the home was controlled, the apartment rooming house is what it's known as, was controlled by the McClaney brothers, the CIA and mobbed-up Havana casino owners, who also owned the exile training camp on the far shore of Lake Pontchartrain in Lacombe, from which at least one of the shooter teams is reputed to have come. Mike McClaney was a Meyer-Lansky lieutenant and Havana casino owner. And here, across Lake Pontchartrain from New Orleans in Lacombe, Louisiana, is where McClaney ran a renegade CIA training camp for assassins. Here are the remains of a place where the CIA trained a secret army which they used not against America's enemies, but against us. This small summer cottage owned by the McClaneys sat beside the training camp. It was being used to store dynamite to be used for bombing Havana. Someone took an 8mm film of this infamous paramilitary camp. On it, investigators for the House Committee on Assassination saw David Ferrie, Lee Harvey Oswald, Guy Bannister, and CIA Mexico City Station Chief David Atlee Phillips, immortalized on an 8mm home movie shot in the summer of 1963. Barry Seal, who took 8mm movie footage which we've used extensively in this program, might have taken that film. But then something happened. After the exciting discovery of this film, and while in the custody of the House of Representatives of the United States of America, it was stolen and never recovered. Who has the power to pull a black bag job in our nation's capital on one of the three co-equal branches of the U.S. government? Probably not the Ghostbusters. Here are a couple other places associated with the Kennedy assassination that should also be listed in the National Historical Registry. This famous building symbolizes the CIA mob merger so well that it should have been declared a National Historic Site. Instead, it was torn down, and today is a federal office building. Housed here were Guy Bannister's offices, which served as the war room for the anti-Castro Cuban Revolutionary Council. They all worked here: Guy Bannister, Dave Ferrie, Lee Oswald, Barry Seal. This is also where Barry met mobster Murray Kessler, with whom he will be arrested in 1972. James Miller is the pilot who was arrested with Barry in that 72 bust.
Well, I was aware that Barry had known Murray Kessler since the 60s at some time, early 60s, and that Murray was one of the ones that we were discussing the overthrow of Cuba with.
And this is Redbird Airfield, just outside Dallas, Texas, where a getaway plane took off unmolested after the assassination. Several hours after the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, in the afternoon of November 22, 1963, an FAA flight controller here at Redbird Airfield saw suspicious activity, which he attempted to report to the FAA. The air traffic controller on duty became suspicious after observing 3 men in business suits board an aircraft an hour after the killing. When the plane took off on runway 17, he asked the pilot if he needed any assistance and then asked which way the plane was heading. The pilot stated south. The controller then watched as the plane flew south for 2 miles, made a hard left, and flew north towards Love Field. The pilot had lied. Those in the tower had received a special bulletin telling them to report suspicious activity to a special security number. And we kept calling that number all afternoon, getting nothing but a busy signal, the controller told us, until we heard that they had caught the lone gunman, as they called it. Then we stopped calling and let the matter drop. 4 years later, an assistant district attorney from Jim Garrison's office came calling to show pictures of possible pilots involved in the incident that day. One of them, a weird-looking character with a funny-looking wig, was on the evening news just a week later. They said his name was David Ferry and that he had committed suicide, the controller told us. That's when I smelled a rat. Barry Seal's CIA recruiter, David Ferry, was under suspicion for participation in the plot to kill Kennedy, less than 24 hours after the assassination. Had Garrison known then what we know today, he might never have turned his suspect over to the FBI to be released with an apology. Just how much can CIA agents get away with? Would you believe child molestation? In 1961, David Ferry was arrested on numerous charges of pedophilia. Meet the New Orleans cops who busted Ferry for molesting young boys.
Well, from the statements we got, we arrested, I think, if I can remember correct, was harboring runaways, contributed to delinquency of juveniles, and I think there was a crime against nature.
Well, we were investigating a Civil Air Patrol outfit whose parents were complaining to us that their boys were, from time to time, on runaway status, were missing, and had been missing for some time. We discovered that he was having sexual relations with the boys, contributing to their delinquency, doing things like if he moved into a new apartment, all the boys would sit around in a circle and masturbate, celebrating the new event. We arrested him. We executed a search warrant as properly as the law calls for.
Normally, anyone arrested for molesting children wants to slip into a hole somewhere and pull it in after him. Instead, David Ferry had warrants issued for the police officers who arrested him.
We discovered that arrest warrants were put out for us. Arrest warrants for myself and other men who had been on the raid at his home. And that was a big shock to me to find that he had secured arrest warrants for our arrests. It was a frightening moment for me because I couldn't imagine having done anything wrong, and to have a search warrant out for me, an arrest warrant out for me was somewhat terrifying, but it went on for a number of days, the fright and the fear and the intimidation that I felt.
Couldn't believe it. It's never happened before, anything like that, you know. I figured he had to know somebody, and that's the only thing I could figure. He had a little power.
That here was a man with incredible power. He had some power somewhere to do this to us. And we were, as I said, 40 years ago, we were young, naive young men. We didn't quite understand what was happening to us. But the thought occurred to me that he had a CIA connection. It did occur to me, and I had really no idea where it was coming from. But I knew it was some incredible force behind him, helping him.
What happened next was even more bizarre.
As the time went on, I started getting phone calls from Cubans who claimed that they were head of the Cuban Revolutionary Front here in New Orleans. And on one occasion, I was told that they could deliver runaway boys for me. This was from the Cubans. If we would promise not to prosecute Captain Ferry.
In America, when you work for the CIA, Being connected means never having to say you're sorry, as we will now see in the budding career of the young Barry Seal. This man, Joe Nettles, was a kind of second father to the young Barry.
I met Barry Seal when I was out there taking flying lessons with Ed Dufford. And Barry was out there all the time. And Barry, he was a senior in high school. I said, Barry, what you gonna do when you get out of high school? I said, I'm gonna work for you. I said, you ain't working for me. You going to college. Told me, he said, Joe, I'm fixing to make $200,000. I said, what you gonna do, rob a bank? He said, no, I'm gonna fly some arms to Cuba. I said, you gonna fly to the penitentiary, where you gonna fly to?
Barry's arrest with a plane load of weapons, we learned, had taken place in the tiny town of Longview, Texas. Joe wishes, more than he can say, that Barry hadn't been so lucky with the judge.
Oh, but he showed me a letter from the judge. I believe it was a very complimentary letter. It exonerated him from any guilt whatsoever. He got out of that. If he hadn't gotten out of that, he never would have gotten into other deeper stuff he got into, because he thought if he could get out of that, he could get out of anything. He thought he was invincible. Pointed a finger at me and said, this man taught me everything I know. I said, no, I didn't. I didn't teach you to take arms to Cuba. He just laughed. He laughed at everything.
Invincible is, of course, just another way of saying above the law. This arrest is just the first of at least 4 separate arrests during Barry Seal's spook career, which we uncovered that have never before been reported. Charlie Montgomery was recruited by Barry in the same way he himself had been recruited by David Ferry.
I met Barry in the summer of '68. I was 11 years old. And it was one of those things where I was the monotonous kid that he couldn't get rid of. So he had to take me in. I was free to roam the neighborhood, and he had a helicopter parked in the front of his house on a trailer, so there was an obvious attraction to an 11-year-old kid who wanted to be around aircraft. I was pretty free to go and come as I pleased, and the older I got, the more freedom I got, where I could disappear for long periods of time, and nobody really wondered why.
Like David Ferry before him, Barry Seal's career clearly illustrates the merger of the CIA and the mob.
It was a late evening one night, probably 10, 11 o'clock. We were at the aircraft company, and this is one of the very few times I've seen Barry nervous. Very rarely was he nervous. And he asked me to go to work for an organization that had been around me, and I'd worked around a lot of the people, and they felt like they liked my work and I would be good for them. But it was a very big commitment. It was much later, after the things started coming out, I had all kinds of suspicions. And then after the '72 arrest, I was real confused because I thought it was more organized crime type thing, and as it went on, it had more of the pictures of some sort of other involvement, maybe secret activity or government or somewhere along those lines. It was very clear that there was no turning back once you cross that boundary. It was a permanent decision.
We were interested in importing shrimp into the New York area from Panama, which could have been and would have been very lucrative. We met first with Carlo Gambino. We explained, Barry did most of the explanation, what we wanted to do. Mr. Gambino seemed to think it might be a good idea, but his nephew Manny was in charge of all the restaurants and various places like that. However, he was busy at the time, so we arranged to meet with him several days later. And several days later, Manny Gambino disappeared. They found blood in his car, and no one has seen Manny Gambino since that time, as far as I know.
In a weapons smuggling bust in 1972, James Miller was arrested with Barry with 7 tons of plastic explosive, part of an ongoing and never-before-revealed CIA plot to overthrow Castro in the 70s.
Barry Seal was led by someone that obviously he had a lot of faith in to believe that Cuba was going to be overthrown with the backing of the United States government through the CIA. We were offered support from the Mexican Air Force. from people. We flew into an Air Force base in Mexico. We met with some people that had uniforms on, and I have no idea what their rank was supposed to have been, but we met with those people and assured by them that we would have their full support if we needed it and wanted it. And then we, of course, returned to the United States, and with the understanding we'd have all the support from everybody, including the United States government, through the CIA. And that's not what transpired.
Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton has long been suspected of having ties with Barry Seal. Guess what? The suspicions were correct.
One of the local DEA agents had told me that Barry had been arrested in Mena, Arkansas. And I ran into Barry a week or two later at a pay telephone, and we were talking, and he said, "Let me show you something." So he showed me a paper that was, somebody has to sign his bond for him to get out of jail, signed by Bill Clinton, who at that time I believe was the Attorney General for the state of Arkansas. So then I began to realize that Barry was pretty heavily politically connected.
But Clinton is just one of the people with household names associated with Barry. On another occasion, then U.S. Attorney Asa Hutchinson took care of things for Barry. According to the state police official in charge of Mena, the Arkansas State Police didn't even try to develop a case against the Mena drug smuggling because Barry was being protected by U.S. Attorney Hutchinson. When Barry Seal associate Roy Fugler took a company called Netivation public recently, it publishes the U.S. Congress Fact Book and has a major internet site for campaign fundraising. The first thing they did was to sign on as their marketing poster boy. Guess who? Arkansas Congressman Asa Hutchinson, the man who prevented Seal from being prosecuted while U.S. Attorney for the district in western Arkansas encompassing Mena. Congressman Hutchinson, shown here with a masked friend, is a member of the Speaker's Task Force for a Drug-Free America, whose mandate is to seek out new and more effective approaches to combating the threat of drug use among the nation's youth. He also somehow found the time to present the case to the Senate for the impeachment of Bill Clinton, where he urged the senators in his closing argument to let justice roll down like mighty waters. Were that to happen, we would urge the congressman not to wear his good suit that day, because we suspect both he and Clinton might get awfully wet. So here then is the Mena scandal's big dirty secret. Barry Seal was no accident. He didn't just stumble onto Mena, nor did he just happen to luck into his eventual career. Instead, he was a lifelong member of what E. Howard Hunt puckishly refers to as clandestine services.
I mean, I sat out here at this airport at the state hangar while the DEA people sat over there watching him modify a Beech 18 right out here on the ramp. And I just asked him, I said, well, why don't you just go get him? And one of the guys told me one time there, he said, he's either the slickest operator there ever was or he's working for us.
There's former Attorney General Ed Meese, for example. Top IRS investigator Bill Duncan was prevented from testifying to Congress about what he knew about a $400,000 bribe which Barry paid Ed Meese. And then, of course, there's Oliver North. At this Baton Rouge restaurant, witnesses told us, North was seen with Barry Seal. And one top law enforcement official told us that an investigating committee of the U.S. Congress in 1988 heard enough evidence of North's drug smuggling to send him to jail for the rest of his life. In America, being connected, of course, means never having to say you're sorry. And we like what former CIA pilot and lawyer Gary Idle said to us about North. Going to church doesn't make you a Christian any more than going to a car wash makes you a car. And then there's the King Air 200, like this one, tying Barry Seal to George W. Bush. While Barry Seal's ties to former President Bush have been well known for years, the most talked about event in Seal's life concerns the persistent rumor that Barry had videotaped a hastily aborted DEA cocaine sting in which were caught George Bush's two sons, George W. and Jeb, caught picking up kilos of cocaine at a Florida airport. we have not been able to prove this persistent allegation, but the search for proof turned up something just as shocking. The King Air used in the alleged sting went from being flown in drug smuggling missions by Barry Seal to later becoming the favorite airplane of Texas Governor George W. Bush. As Bogey might have put it, of all the planes in all the world, he had to fly in mine. And the owners of the King Air, in between Barry and George W. Bush, all had ties to the Bush family and were involved in some of the most notorious and unpunished financial frauds of the 1980s. And this one King Air reveals, like nothing else we've seen, the bipartisan nature of this scandal. We discovered a note in Barry Seal's own handwriting, revealing that the man who originally gave this plane to Seal was a close associate of Charles Manat, the national chairman during the early 80s of the Democratic Party. We remembered a curious incident from the 1984 Democratic Convention when Walter Mondale, the party's presidential nominee, was prevented from choosing his own man as party chairman, the presidential candidate's traditional prerogative. They wouldn't let him replace Charles Manat.
When the Democratic Convention was called to order this afternoon, the gavel was in the hands of Democratic National Committee Chairman Charles Manat. As party chairman, the job of calling the convention to order was rightfully his. As Sandra Van Oker reports, over the weekend, the job very nearly went to someone else.
The formalities began smoothly enough. But behind the facade, there was discord. The result of Walter Mondale's attempt this weekend to dump Californian Charles Manat as National Party chairman and replace him with Georgia State Chairman Burt Lance. When reaction from party leaders was so fiercely negative, Mondale backed off.
Could Manat have been just too good a fundraiser to be replaced? Oil companies, we've learned, make excellent drug money laundering vehicles. Sources told us that this man, Democratic power broker Richard Benveniste, had incorporated a Trinity Oil or Trinity Energy to launder money for his client, Barry Seal. This gray-haired lawyer is the same man who defended Bill Clinton on the Whitewater Committee, the same committee which was haunted by the ghost of Barry Seal, according to the Wall Street Journal. We discovered that back in the early 80s, he represented both Barry Seal and Bill Clinton. We found an oil company called Trinity Energy that was sold by Barry's partner, attorney Michael Roy Fugler, for $22 million to a shadowy company suspected of being controlled by none other than Arkansas kingpin Jackson Stevens. We also traced to Trinity Energy, a Delaware-listed company, to the phone number of a company formed by former Pentagon officials called ICF Kaiser International, whose chairman, a man who had sat on its board for over 9 years, was former Congressman Tony Coelho, who resigned from Congress rather than face an ethics probe.
Congressional Democrats awoke to even more unexpected headlines today. The number 3 man in the House leadership, California Congressman Tony Coelho, has also decided to quit. Deborah Potter has our report.
It was a stunning surprise. The number 3 Democrat in the House, Tony Coelho, calling it quits rather than face a protracted investigation of his financial dealings.
Today, Tony Coelho was the head of Al Gore's presidential campaign. Why would Gore put someone so tainted in so visible a position? Maybe Coelho's good at fundraising too. Just how deep does this scandal go? A block off Bourbon Street in New Orleans is Royal Street, since the 1830s home to pricey galleries and antique shops. This elegant gallery belongs to a man named Dave Dixon, known as one of Louisiana's most prominent citizens, an intimate of governors for decades. Dixon is locally revered as the father of the Louisiana Superdome. And for decades, this man, Dave Dixon, was also the CIA handler of the person known as the most successful drug smuggler in American history, Barry Seal. And at the trial of Clay Shaw, the only man ever charged in the murder of our president, Dave Dixon was a character witness for the accused. But the truly saddest part of this whole scandal is the way our free press has looked the other way. They called Seal's killing a gangland-style murder, but Barry Seal was not murdered by the Medellin cartel. The cover story that Jorge Ochoa, head of the cartel, caused Seal to be murdered in a contract killing is as much a big lie as anything ever churned out of Nazi propaganda mills during World War II. Incredibly, we discovered that on the night Barry Seal was slain, 3 other top lieutenants of the Medellin cartel were also murdered.
Our lead story, Metro News has uncovered some new information in the investigation into the assassination of Barry Seal. Reporter Dana Kay has the story.
Metro News has learned that there were a total of 4 drug-related killings the same day Barry Seal was gunned down here in Baton Rouge. And all of them seem to have been connected to the same drug ring operated out of Colombia. Metro News reported last night that a Colombian named Pablo Carrera was shot and killed in Colombia the same night Barry Seal was gunned down in Baton Rouge by a professional hit squad. Carrera was identified as the number 2 man in the Colombian drug organization headed by Jorge Ochoa. Metro News has now learned that 2 other Ochoa associates were shot to death at the same time. Another Colombian, Pablo Achilla, was executed in Colombia, and the 4th Ochoa associate to die was a woman identified only as Barbara. She was killed in Miami.
Who killed Seal? Just 10 days before he died, in a typical display of the fearlessness for which he was justly famous, he threatened to expose the gun running and drug smuggling that flourished in Mena, Arkansas. The man he threatened, then Vice President George Bush. All 3 of the guys on trial, Richard Sharpstein, the Miami attorney for one of the Colombians convicted, told us, all told their attorneys that once they reached the U.S., their actions were directed by a military officer, whom they very quickly figured out to be Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. Barry Seal died for a simple reason, a reason which redeems him somewhat in our eyes. He was getting ready to talk. There's more, much more, to this story than we have time for here. It's in our book, Barry and the Boys. And a full airing of the Mena drug scandal can be found in our 2-hour special, The Secret Heartbeat of America. You can receive either or both by priority mail by calling the phone number shown at the end of this show. But we want to close with something we heard from someone who was just a small child when JFK was murdered, his son John. At a press conference announcing George magazine, he was asked if he would use his new publication to probe his father's assassination. No, he said, too much time has passed for anything effective to be done. Time, he said, is the great enemy of the truth. Meaning that by the time the public had figured out that John Kennedy was murdered by people who shot their way into power, just like Hitler's Nazis did, it was too late to do anything about it. Time is the great enemy of the truth. By the time we figure out that they've been lying to us about who controls the drug trade, they'll all be rich beyond measure.